Hey, good day, folks. Welcome again to the Profitable Sheep and Goat Production Podcast. It's Matt and Leon here today. And today we want to talk about a very seasonal subject, or very in-season subject, and that is breeding time. We want to talk a bit about making sure your rams are ready for breeding season, your ewes are ready for breeding season. So to get started, Matt, where do we want to start with this?
Well, we're probably a couple of weeks behind the ball here for some flocks, because the first thing I thought we should talk about is how soon before breed or how early before breeding season should we start considering these things. And for a lot of us, for me and for you too, probably, Leon, we're looking to turn the rams out another week or two here. So um, some of those things we're going to talk about here, we already kind of missed, but if that is the case, write it down for next year and be prepared for next year. And it is a good time to start thinking about it. So,
Yeah.
so when do you start thinking about breeding season?
Well, I've been thinking about it ever since probably April. And
Well,
that goes
and you
all the
probably
way
should.
that goes all the way back to making plans for what rams you're going to use. We're going to buy any new rams. And I know for myself, I have a group of yearlings. They lambed first time here this past spring, and I have really been keeping my eye on them ever since weaning.
Yeah,
I was a little concerned on body condition and just watching how fast they're bouncing back, trying to plan ahead for what I'm going to do
yeah,
prior breeding.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's
and
where we're at right now. It's time to get on the ball
yeah.
because next week I want to turn rams out.
Yeah. And that's a good point. We're going to talk a little more about body condition, but that's a very good point of look, you should be looking at that when you wean the lambs off the ewes, looking ahead, when do I want to breed them back? What body condition are they in now? In your case, yearlings like that tend to be pretty skinny when you wean the lambs. So you want to be looking at those all along there to make sure that they're putting some body condition on, rather than a month before breeding season realizing that, man, these things are way under conditioned, because you can't get them up to condition anymore at that point. So yeah, so it's never too early to start thinking about breeding season. And even this year, I'm trying to be better at this of looking ahead. Like when I turn my rams out this year, if there's something I don't like about the condition of the ewes or whatever, to write that down for next year or next breeding season. Okay, make sure start looking at this earlier. So in a way, start thinking about the next breeding season already. Um, Never too early to start.
It's way too easy just to keep pushing that ball down the road. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, if you need to order feed, the feed has to be in the bin to,
Yep.
wait till a week before.
Yeah. For me, it has to be like if I don't write it down on paper, like 4 weeks before breeding season, we want to do this, or 6 weeks before we want to do that. Too often it doesn't happen. I'm trying to get more scheduled on that kind of things, because and I'm not a schedule person. I know we've talked about this on here before. I like to fly from the seat of my pants, but that does not work well with the breeding program or farming in general.
Well, we've been putting the rams in almost to the day for the last 12 years, like
Mm-hmm.
usually around the 25th. And yeah, it's not really any excuse for me to not be on my game, but it just creeps up on you. It,
Yeah.
so what's the most overlooked piece of this puzzle, do you think?
Well, I think it's the Rams, or anyway, the most important part is the Rams. And that's like you said, that's something you should start a couple months before your breeding season. Um, just making sure you have the Rams you need. Um, and then, you know, probably 2 months before you should start looking at those rams and evaluating, is there nothing wrong with them, no testicle damage or deformities, anything like that. I know some people do breeding exams. We don't. We just evaluate what we can see, but it's never too early to start looking at those rams and also make sure they're in good body condition.
Yeah. A breeding soundness exam is not a bad idea at all. I mean, if you have a vet that can do that,
Yeah.
if it would, I never had it happen, but boy, it would be a bummer if you
Yeah.
turned out an expensive ram with a group of ewes and you were like, it comes around the lambing time and they weren't bred. That would be very, very frustrating. I
I
guess a
think,
cleanup ram, if you're running a cleanup ram, that would fix that problem. You would
yeah,
at least have some lambs on the ground, hopefully. But
yeah, yeah, and I agree. And breeding soundness exam is a would be a useful tool. But there's also, my vet was a little resistant to the idea of doing that one. Just to do it on all my rams would get time consuming and expensive. Uh, and her take was that, well, we can do a breeding exam a month before breeding season, but there's also always still a chance that something happened to that ram in between there.
right.
So she was kind of, yeah, maybe not worth it, but that's where rotating your rams or running a cleanup ram is really helpful, because like you said, Leon, you don't want to come to lambing season and find out 50 ewes weren't bred because that one ram would be a dud. So either running multiple rams or rotating them or using a cleanup ram's probably a good strategy.
Yeah. And a lot of commercial flocks probably are running multiple rams in the same
Yeah.
group. Matt and I both are seed stock producers, so we have to know who the sire is on the lambs. And I think we have both ran multi-sire mating groups where we DNA test the lambs. That's in a kind of a specific scenario where we would do that. But most
Sure.
of the time we'd be splitting up a group of ewes to one ram.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so my strategy on that would be, if there's a questionable ram that for some reason uh I'm not 100% convinced this ram's fertile, or I think there might be an issue, that's where a breeding exam would really be helpful, just to verify that he is indeed fertile and ready to go.
Right. And the other thing is sheep have the Katahdin breed, yeah, that we have. I don't know if this really pertains to this subject, but I'm just trying to compare it to, like, a lot of cattle guys will do breeding exams on their bulls, won't they? Why would they do it quicker than we would?
Probably because there is more of a chance for them to not be fertile. Or I think kind of what maybe you were getting at is, within like certain breeds, it would be more likely for that to happen. So if you have a breed where that is a concern, then certainly I would consider it.
Yeah.
But like you said, the Katahdins, I've never had one that turned up a dud. I don't know that I've ever heard of anyone having one, but I mean, I'm sure it happens.
Yeah.
Um,
What does Michelle Canfield say? Doesn't she run that on her ads? If you don't want lambs, don't turn out the rams.
yeah, yeah, that's about with the Katahdins. Um, so yeah, but it's still something to consider. Is that ram fertile? Another, if you're using ram lambs, is that ram big enough and old enough to breed? They can breed pretty young. I've used 6 month old rams already, and we routinely use 7 month old rams for breeding. Um, but if you're using a ram that's that young, is he big enough? Is he uh, mature enough to breed? Is something to consider.
Right. maybe now's the time to talk a little bit about ram to ewe ratio briefly. I know for myself, I often tell people, so we lamb starting into January. So January, February, meaning we breed the end of August into beginning of September. So my January, February born ram lambs, when I sell them, I often tell people if they're breeding end of August, that ram should easily cover 25 ewes.
Yeah.
That ram would be like what, 7 months old?
Yeah. 7 months.
And
Yeah.
every month after that 7 month mark, you can probably just start bumping that number just a little bit.
A, a little bit, maybe. I'd be hesitant to bump it too hard though, because we're using some fall-born rams as well, which so are like so in fall-borns, I usually tell people so they'd be at that point they'd be almost a year old when they're breeding for the first time. But even in that scenario, I usually tell people not more than 30 ewes per ram. It's still a young ram. Either way you look at it, I'd be a little careful pushing those numbers too high. Now,
So if I have a guy that says, well, I'm not breeding till October, I have 35 ewes, it doesn't make sense for him to buy a second ram, does it?
well, what I would tell him is he's pushing it. If he's okay with his breeding seasons being spread out a little longer, that ram's going to cover those ewes if he's
It's
in
just
good
going to get
condition.
it's going to get
If
drug out though.
it might not. Dr. Kennedy had a story of a ram that he was showing, and he brought back a ram lamb that he was showing, and he brought back from the show, turned him out to like I think 100 ewes for I forget exactly like 2 weeks or something, just looking to get some ewes bred and some lambs out of this ram, and then he was going to use another ram on the rest of those ewes later on. And he ended up getting like 80 ewes bred with this ram lamb. So it is possible for them to breed a lot more, but it's hard to know which rams are going to do that and which are not. So to your guy with 35 ewes, just in theory, he's pushing it. The Rams probably going to cover him, but they might be drug out a little further.
Right, right. That's
Other
something I
thing,
often warn him of. I mean,
yeah,
technically, he might breed 50 ewes, no problem, but a very high
right,
risk of your lambing window getting drugged.
right,
Instead of
yeah,
having a 3 week, you might have a 6 or 8 week
yeah, and
lambing window.
you just don't know which Rams can do that. Um, One thing though, if he says, "Well, I want to breed," I have 20 mature ewes that or 25 mature ewes that I want to breed in September here, and then my ewe lambs I'm not going to breed till October or November, and I have 10 or 15 of them. He can easily cover all those ewes because they're spread out. Or
Right.
even if he'd have 50 mature ewes, and says, "Well, I don't mind if they're spread out," he could probably cover those. Although I hate leaving a ram lamp in with the ewes for a long time. Like if you're trying to cover that many, I would put them in for maybe 4 or 5 weeks. Get the ewes bred and then pull them out and run them in as a cleanup a little later on.
Yeah, and what happens in that window between the two groups? That ram can't be put on a bread and water diet.
Right.
You need to make sure he's being taken care of.
Yeah,
I
that's yeah.
I see that's a little problem I see sometimes where guys will take one of those young ram lambs home, turn them out, and they might let them run with the ewes all the way till who knows when. Maybe they're just on grass for the rest of the fall.
Right.
Sometimes those rams can struggle a little bit if you aren't careful.
Yeah. Well, and I don't think it's so much of a problem with the diet that the ewes are getting not being adequate for a ram. It's more of a problem of you have a young ram that needs a really good diet, but he's in there running ewes, chasing ewes, even if they aren't bred. If you have a ram that's like a ram that's really aggressive with breeding, he's going to be chasing ewes regardless if they're cycling or not. Even if he has all the ewes settled, he's still going to be at least checking on them, and he's not going to be putting on body condition. Because I run into that same problem a lot with young rams. You really, if you're gonna keep running them with the ewe, which a lot of people like doing that, so they don't have to pull them out and put them somewhere else. If you need to do that, just make sure you monitor his body condition, and don't let that drop too low, because that can ruin a young ram.
So back to the discussion on the ram to ewe ratio. What do you feel for mature ram? I'm talking like a 2-year-old or something.
I usually say 50 ewes for a mature ram.
Right.
That's kind of industry standard. There again, I think you could have some rams that could cover a lot more. But that's a nice safe number. Um, and that's where, like with a commercial producer, if he can run, say, 3 rams together, to 150 ewes, or possibly even a little over 150 ewes if you have good rams, takes a lot of that risk out. Because if you're putting 50 ewes to one ram, if he's a dud, or if he's only breeding half of those ewes, it increases your risk. Where if you can put multiple rams in, you can probably push those numbers up a little bit.
Yeah. So just to kind of summarize that, a ram lamb, maybe 25 ewes, and mature ram. And when I say mature ram, I'm just thinking something over a year old, 2-year old, closer to 50 ewes. Do you use marking harnesses or rattle powder at all?
We do some. Typically we have not been in the fall here, just because we're too lazy to do it. And I guess the main reason we do it, like in the springtime, is we want to know that ewes are getting bred. So we're not using it as an exact, like I know some shepherds will like mark, okay, this ewe got bred on so and so date. We're never doing that. We're more using it as an overall, okay, it looks like most of the ewes got bred. Or that's also a really good way to make sure that a ram is actually breeding ewes. Especially if you have a young ram, he might not be, he might not know what's going on. He might not be breeding ewes. So that's one way to keep track of that. Now, you don't, that doesn't tell you that they actually got bred for sure, that he was fertile, but it tells you that he's actually breeding ewes. So we use some. We typically don't in the fall. I was thinking I might this year again, just to keep track a little better of what's going on. We
Yeah.
use the marking harnesses.
Yeah. I've used some rattle powder in the past, but you have to put it on too often. It's kind of a pain. It's dirty, smeary.
What marking harness do you find that you like?
The I usually get from Premier.
Do you get their wide, their 2-inch ones, or do you get the ones with like a 1-inch strap? The one is called a deluxe.
Looks like they cost, time of recording here, about $28. And
Yeah,
what I like about them is the part that goes behind their leg, that girth type piece.
yeah,
That's pretty soft stuff. I had trouble with chafing on some of the other breeding
yeah,
harnesses,
yeah.
and they get sore.
That nylon one, I had problems with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Which
The
if you're on for too long.
the one with the leather on, the cross your heart one, that one was made a little more for a ram that had like a pointed brisket, so it would stay in place better. It wouldn't slip off to the one side, and I never had that much trouble with any of my rams.
It might work better on goats.
It says it's actually for goats. It says for rams or goats with pointed briskets.
Yeah, yeah,
Anyway,
yeah,
so in the fall, sometimes I'll put a harness on, and I won't. It'll basically run until the crayon quits,
yeah.
and usually it's there just for a feel good thing. Like, all right, looks like he's getting the job done good enough.
Mhm.
Um, and we just assume that especially a young ram, you at least know he's trying to get his job done.
Yeah, yeah. That's often where I use them too in the fall is on young rams or like I said, I've used rams in the fall that were only like 6 month old already. So like we're using them in September and they would have maybe been born in end of March. In those scenarios, I want to make sure those rams are actually breeding ewes. So, but they are a
Right.
valuable tool. Like I said, especially for spring breeding, like out of season breeding where you want to know if they're actually getting used bred. They're super helpful for that. And just overall they have different color crayons that you can use. So you can switch the colors out and see which ewes might have got bred. So say you use red for the first 2 weeks or a little over, and then you switch to blue. Now you know who bred in that first cycle, and the ewes that are bred with blue bred in the second cycle. So that's kind of where I was thinking of using them this fall is to identify those ewes that bred early and actually make a different management group of those on my recorder so that I know when I go to lambing, like, okay, let's put these ewes in the barn first. You're going to lamb first. And then the ewes that the cleanup ram gets, we'll put in a separate group. So,
Sure. Yeah, very good. So I think that just about covers it for the Rams. Anything we missed?
yeah, I think one thing we should talk about a little bit yet on Rams is body condition score, and just making sure you get those Rams that they have a good body condition score going into breeding season, especially if you're using them hard and for a long time. If you have mature rams that you're expecting to use on multiple groups that fall, they can really drop body condition once they're breeding. So make sure they're in good body condition score going into breeding, and
Yeah,
that you should
there's
start looking at 6 weeks before breeding season, probably minimum.
there's no way you'll get them to gain weight during breeding. That's for sure.
No, no. So
So on the ewe pre-breeding, we talked
well,
about that briefly, I guess.
sure. We talked about that briefly, where you should basically start looking at that when you wean the prior group of lambs, you know, kind of to know where to set you up. I think when you should really start taking a really close look at your ewe flock, I would say 4 to 6 weeks before breeding season, you should probably get your ewe flock in, run them through the chute. Just check for that would be a good time to check for bad udders. Anything else you don't like, call any ewes you don't like, and then also take a closer look at body condition score on your ewes, because some of those you might want to start flushing 4 weeks before breeding season, and some of them you might want to wait till 2 weeks before breeding season if they are in pretty good condition already. So I usually go about a month before breeding season. We bring the ewes in, run them through the chute. Just like I said, call any that we don't like for whatever various reasons. And then also that's where we look at body condition score to decide how soon we're going to start flushing.
So it might not be the best time to sell a call ewe necessarily from the market perspective, but there's no point flush feeding that ewe
Yeah.
if you're
Yeah.
ship anyway.
My best time to sell coal is whenever I identify her as a call. Get her out of here. I don't want to feed her. Um,
Yeah.
Obviously, for different people that might be different. If you have a lot of grass, maybe you want to hold them till a better time. But for us, if we identify that you as a call, I want her on the next truck that's going to New Holland.
Yeah.
And the other reason this is a good time to look at it is for other problems like mastitis or anything like that. That's hard to see it at weaning. But now it's a couple weeks or couple months down the road, you can easily see those ewes that might have lumbeotters or things like that, and get rid of them.
So your body condition scoring, checking udders, and then you're gonna decide what you want to do as a to improve that body condition.
Mm-hmm.
Do you split into different groups based on body condition or not necessarily?
It depends on if there's a big range in body condition. Like my ewes this fall, I did, and some of those had just weaned lambs. Like some of them had lambed in the winter time and then not bred for fall lambs, so they were in pretty good body condition. And then some of them had just weaned lambs here in July sometime. So like when we were checking them, they had just weaned lambs a couple weeks before that. Really, probably only a week or two before that. So we did split anything that was a lower body score. We split in a separate group and started flushing them right away about a month prior to breeding. And then anything that was in a pretty good body condition, we put in another group and just started flushing them here this week, about 2 weeks before we want to turn the rams out. So I don't always do that, but with this fall lambing, there was definitely a big, or fall breeding, there was definitely a big range in the body condition score. So I did split them accordingly.
Yeah, and if you have enough animals, it makes it worse. Enough animals that would make a different group
Sure.
makes it worthwhile managing it separately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's not always going to be practical, but we should probably talk about what is body condition score and how do you do that. Because you can see some by looking at them, but I know I'm always surprised when I run them through the chute and actually do the body condition score. There's always some ewes in there that I thought were nice and fat that maybe don't have as high of a body condition score. So what is body condition score and how do we do that?
So I have often heard of the illustration of your knuckles make a fist,
Uh-huh.
and when you reach into that wool or that hair on that sheep, and you feel that backbone, if you would liken it to whether it's like the bumpy knuckles on the top of your hand, just on how basically you're measuring how much fat cover you have there.
And you do that by running your hand over their backbone, but also over their, what do they call the bone right in front of the hips there, that transition where it goes to the gut. The sharper you can feel that, the lower the body condition scores, the less back fat she has on it.
Yeah. And I've often used the 1 to 5, 1 being skin and bone, 5 being basically obese.
Yeah.
You want them to be what, a 2.5 to a 3 prior flushing?
I would maybe
3.
be a bit lower than some of the experts would say, but I'd prefer them to be about a 2.5 prior to flushing and about a 3 at breeding. I think they would maybe say, I think they would, I think typically you hear they should be 3 to 3.5 at breeding.
Right.
Does that sound right? I think
yeah,
so.
I think so.
For me, that a 3.5 is flirting with the fat side a little bit more than I'd like to at breeding. I don't want to get those ewes too fat too early either. And everybody's, so that 1 to 5 scale is kind of what everybody uses, but there's going to be some variation according to producer, as we won't all agree on what's a 3,
Right.
in other words. So you kind of have to use that scale and learn what you want to see with that.
And you also need to know your program. Somebody that is strictly forage based,
Yeah.
you're not going to get that body condition recovered as quickly, probably as if you're going to feed or up your nutrition 4 to 6 weeks prior to lambing, that kind of stuff. What ration that you is going to be on and throughout gestation, you can really change that body condition score.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, maybe a forage based operation would rather see that you closer to that 3.5. That might not bother them as quick.
Yeah, but
You
they're
don't think?
probably not going to get them up there
They
but
probably
yeah, it won't bother them as quick because in a strictly forage based system, you're not going to be as worried about getting that U2 fat as for when we're in the barn on TMR. We really need to be careful we don't get those animals too fat because it's easy to.
that's I was trying to
Yeah,
make, I guess, that
yeah,
you're going to have a higher risk with your the way you
with our
manage your
system.
nutrition with your
Yeah,
system. You're
yeah,
going to risk them getting overweight pretty
yeah,
quick.
yeah,
Now there are some guys that have really good forage and they just about get their ewes too fat.
yeah. Well, when we were doing a once a year lambing, and we'd run our lambs out on good or ewes out on good grass all summer open, that was a big problem. Our ewes would come into breeding fat, and we couldn't even flush them. Um,
Yeah.
so that's something to consider. While we're on that subject, though, something else we should talk about that I see happen a lot, and that's important to me in my accelerated system is also it's hard to put condition on ewes after they're bred. You can do it over breeding time, but once you get to mid gestation, if you're trying to put condition on your ewes, what's going to happen at that point, to my experience anyway, is they start putting that nutrition into the lambs, and now you end up with a ewe that's too skinny because she was too skinny going into breeding season, and her lambs are too big. So that's why another reason why it's really important to get your ewes in good body condition at breeding is because you can't put much condition on ewes after breeding.
Without having a making a problem down the road.
Yeah, well, even period, you really can't because at that point, once you get to mid gestation, you're trying to put condition on ewes. To my experience, they don't put condition on; they put it into the lambs. So now you have to still have that ewe that's too skinny, and her lambs are too big. You kind of get a double whammy.
Yeah, it
Um,
really complicates things.
you can, I think, if your ewes are a body condition score of 3.5 or 3 to 3.5 at breeding, and you have them on a good plane of nutrition, you'll probably come into lambing season at a 3.5 to 4, which is actually pretty ideal. Um, I wouldn't want to be much over a 4, but there again, you can add a little bit condition, but we're talking of realizing at breeding season your ewes are a 2 or 2.5. You might want to consider just pushing your breeding season down the road another 2 or 3 weeks so you can put some condition on those ewes.
Yeah, and this scenario or this equation is not very scientific, maybe you could say, but 3 weeks to gain a half a body condition score
Mm-hmm.
is something that I've heard already.
Yeah.
That's going to be a lot of depending factors that play into that, but
Well, but you can only put on weight that fast. So, I mean, that makes sense. You can't just 3 weeks prior decide we're gonna gain a one body condition score in 3 weeks time. You're not gonna do that.
well, and because you can't make a ration change very fast for one thing.
True. Takes you a week or so just to get that ration bumped up.
Yeah.
But that's to the point of should you start flushing those ewes a month before or 2 weeks before? or maybe even 6 weeks before. If they're in pretty low body condition, you might want to start 6 weeks because you want them gradually gaining weight going into breeding season.
Right. And it depends on how you're going to flush, probably. If you're going to use grain, well, you need 7 to 10 days to get them from no grain to a pound. I mean,
Yeah.
7 to 10 days minimum, probably not.
Minimum. Yeah, you could start them off. Yeah, you could do it in 7 days would be pushing it.
Yeah.
You could start them off at half a pound and then a week later bump them up to a pound, but that's definitely pushing it.
Yeah.
So now you're down. So if you started 3 weeks prior to breeding season, now you're down to 2 weeks.
2 weeks on full ration.
Yeah.
Yep.
Start looking at that body condition early.
Right. That way, that way you can have a plan in place for when you need to start and what you're going to use. Yeah. So are we ready to talk some now about what goes into flush feeding, what we use?
Sure. I think we've alluded to flushing quite a bit here, but I don't think we've ever really said what flushing is for someone that doesn't know. But so basically, flushing is upping their nutrition, however you do that. A lot of people have the perspective to flush them, you feed grain, and that's not necessarily true. It's upping their nutrition prior to breeding to increase they should be increasing body weight is where you get that flushing effect from. So,
and this can either be saving a pasture with a high clover, could be alfalfa, something some pretty good forage. You could use that to flush feed. Matt, you use a TMR, and you're going to talk about that more. For years, I have just supplemented with grain.
Yep.
Putting some troughs in my paddocks because usually they're on pasture that time of year. One of the farms we lived on, I actually had limited pasture, and so it actually worked pretty good. We just about have our be ahead of our pasture like early August, and I would actually dry lot some of the ewes, and it just worked out well. That's when I would flush feed. I'd start feeding a little grain and hay, and my breeding groups, I usually have multiple breeding groups, so multiple groups of sheep are not nice to manage on pasture anyway.
Yeah.
So it actually worked out pretty good. I'd have some in a dry lot, some in the barn, overbreeding. They were there close to the barn. It was easy to feed them. And usually I was supplementing with something like about a pound per head per day, usually, whether it was shelled corn or maybe a 14-15% textured feed. Now that we have more pasture, and also since we have some saliva lick feeders, I've used them the last several years. Usually I get my ewes adjusted to the ration, and then I just move my lick feeder throughout the pasture. And just reminding you folks that this call is sponsored by Lost Creek Wholesale, and they are the distributor for universal feeders, saliva lick feeder for cattle, sheep, and goats. So with my universal feeders, I can restrict the sheep's intake to a little less than a pound per head per day. So I don't have to be filling those troughs every day. I don't have to drag multiple. Usually I'd use pipes, like a 6-inch PVC or a black culvert pipe cut in half. I'd have to drag a couple of them around. If you're moving sheep every couple of days or whatever, that's not very efficient. We have learned to really like those saliva lick feeders for flush feeding, just from the perspective of being able to fill that feeder, and the sheep have 24/7 access to it, and we can adjust that restrictor down, and using saliva as the limiting factor, they can only get a preset amount out of that feeder. I just keep a 10-foot piece of rope tied to the toe loop on my feeder. I throw it over the ball hitch on my side by side and drag it to the next section whenever we're ready to move sheep. So
I just wanted to say the lick feeders are really great for that, for flush feeding ewes, because that was always a pain, flushing ewes that are out on grass, like you said, just having to drag feeders out there, having to go out feed them every day. Um, the 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 lick feeders are great for that. So yeah, I agree.
So what I have in my bin right now to flush feed with, just got another load here about a week ago. It's just a whisker of about 14-15%. Very basic mix, whole shelled corn, oats, and some whole roasted beans. Has just 50 pounds of molasses to the ton,
Mm-hmm.
and that flows very well in the lick feeder. I like a little bit of oats in that mix. I think the oats make it a little easier to restrict the ration
Yeah.
compared to whole shelled corn. Whole shelled corn's pretty slippery, shiny surface, does not absorb as much moisture when the sheep are licking it out of the feeder. And I've been messing with that mix, just 300 pounds of oats to a 1 ton in a 1 ton mix or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I think that seems to be working pretty good.
And what percent protein is that ration then? Do
It's
you
just a
know?
little over 14.
Okay, so right in that 14, yeah,
I
14.
should I should look again to confirm that
Yeah,
it might be, maybe it is a 15.
yeah, yeah. And that's about where I would, without knowing any of the other scenarios behind it, but typically if guys are looking to flush on pasture, that's about what I would recommend as a 15%
Yeah.
ration. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy like you're saying. Like it's just a you have your shelled corn and your beans for protein, and then you have some oats in there yet, which helps with the flowability. And there's also other benefits to oats, but yeah, I like that.
So we have no mineral pack in that mix,
Uh-huh.
but we do feed a free choice loose mineral, have it available all the time. And now this time of the year is definitely not a time to be letting that mineral feeder get empty.
Yep.
And really, this that mineral feeder that goes back to, you can't just, oh, we gotta make sure these girls are getting what they need 3 weeks before we turn the ram out. Like,
Yeah,
making sure they're getting what they need well in advance, all the time, really, is pretty
yeah,
important to
yeah.
fertility.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, Matt, you used to feed grain similar, maybe in troughs or in a lick feeder or something, but now that you have your barn set up for TMR, tell us a little bit about what you're doing there.
Yeah, so we still do some of both. We'll still breed out on pasture or on cover crops, depending on the scenario and how it holds out. And actually, most times in the fall, we do some of both simultaneously, just because, like you said, we'll get. I mean, we have four different breeds now, and then like even just with our Cataldan flock, we might be splitting those in 6 or 7 different breeding groups plus our other breeds. So we're often 8, 10, 12 breeding groups is not unusual for us in the fall here. So that gets to be a lot of pens, or if you're out on pasture, gets to be a lot of different pastures. So we'll do some of both. So I guess for what goes in the barn, we just adjust our TMR ration um, to a flushing ration. So we'll have them on a maintenance ration, and then we'll adjust to a flushing ration. And there's no extra grain in there. It's just well, like right now we're feeding barlage and alfalfa, and we have yeah, our flushing requirements that we like to meet. And so we'll adjust our ration to that and do it there. Um, so what we also do is a little bit similar to what Leon was saying, is where we'll start running out of grass. Usually already like in July, we start catching up to our grass. Like you start catching up to that spring flush. So we'll even sometimes as early as beginning of July, especially this year, we had a dry year here. we'll be pulling ewes in off of pasture and putting them in the barn in a dry lot scenario on a maintenance ration. So what we can do then at that point for flushing, so some of our ewes are actually going to go out on grass and on good grass, and that's going to be their flush coming off of a maintenance ration in the barn, putting them out on good grass. We rarely use grain even when we're out on grass because, like I said, um, we're taking them from a maintenance ration into the barn, putting them out on good grass, which is going to cause them to increase their body weight and have the same effect without the hassle of feeding grain. Because even with the universal lick feeders, if you have multiple breeding groups out there, now you need multiple feeders, you need to move them, you need to get them adjusted to what you want your ewes to get. It still takes some time. So yeah, so that's what we do in what's in the barn. We just increase the TMR to their flushing needs, or we'll put them out on good grass. If we are putting them out on maybe subpar grass, we will feed some grain, whether it's through just putting a bunk out there and feeding them, hand feeding them, or the lick feeders. So that's what we do. I mean, the main thing is just to be looking at increasing the body condition on those ewes going into breeding season. That's the idea of flushing. And we've done it on, like, in our spring breeding, we'll often be doing it, breeding them on cover crops. In that situation, because we're going into like end of April into May, our cover crop quality is usually dropping at that point. So that's where grain is really useful for us to up that nutrition for those ewes, because those cover crops they're not as potent as they were earlier anymore, and that's where we often use the universal feeders for grain flushing.
Yeah. So we've been talking about flush feeding and the fact that it's a pretty critical time to make sure you're using good enough body condition. And we said one of the reasons is because once she's bred, it's hard to get her to gain too much weight without making problems with getting the lambs too big. Yeah. But there's one other piece to the puzzle we didn't talk about as to why we flush feed. So a ewe that is increasing in her body or going up in body condition is going to be quicker to ovulate more and maybe sooner.
Yeah.
Which is going to increase your lambing percentage.
Yeah. Do you remember what that number is that studies have shown that you can increase your lambing percentages by with the flushing effect?
It's at least 25%. That the New Zealand study I was referring to before we got on the recording here.
Yeah.
That one study, they saw at least a 25% and maybe even up to a 30%, depending on how far in advance, if they flush fed a little longer before breeding. But there's a lot of variables in that equation. A ewe that is already too fat is not going to respond to flush feeding like a ewe that is. It's actually pretty critical that you actually want your ewe to lose some body condition during lactation. Mm-hmm. So weaning time, you want her to be run down. You want that ewe to milk off some.
Yeah.
You don't want her to milk down to nothing, but getting that body condition pulled down some is actually good from the perspective of getting her to breed back well and have more twins and triplets the next time around.
Yeah. We didn't really talk about that, but if your ewes are too fat at breeding, there's no sense in flushing them. that you're not going to have that flushing effect for one, and you're just going to make your ready to fat ewes even fatter. So um,
This is another reason is that you need to be looking at that body condition well in advance, because
mm-hmm.
you can manage to make this work better for your flock. If you think your ewes aren't milking down enough, what's the reason for that? Maybe you can look at that. But I know of guys that actually feed their ewes accordingly to keep that ewe from getting too fat
Sure.
prior to breeding season, so
Yeah.
that they can have that flushing effect.
Yeah. We'll do that with our ewes that are, so say they lamb in the winter time and they don't breed for fall lamb, so they're going to be lambing on a 1 year schedule. Um, those ewes, we have to be careful they don't get too fat because they're open for a couple months, and well, oftentimes we were flushing them to breed in the spring and then they never bred. So we'll try to we'll throw those ewes on a very maintenance ration. Like sometimes we'll even put them in the barn for a month with nothing but corn fodder. To You don't drop much. You can drop a little bit of condition on them, but that's not really the goal. You really don't want to be taking them backwards too much. You can a little bit, but you want to just make sure you maintain them so that when breeding season rolls around, you can flush them, and you don't want them to be too fat at breeding season. Can't stress that enough either.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked a lot about making sure they're up to condition, but you also don't want them too fat at breeding season.
Right. Maybe now is also the time to just mention that ewe lambs do not respond in the same way
Yeah.
to flushing as a mature ewe does. Body condition on a ewe lamb is very, very important, I think, as to how they breed up and to how well they handle feeding lambs.
Yeah.
I think it's very important. And I think probably body condition, in my experience, I think body condition affects how early that lamb breeds.
Yeah.
It affects some her number of lambs born probably, but I think it plays a big part in how early she'll breed up.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't want to try and flush your ewe lambs necessarily. You just want them on a kind of increasing nutrition plane so they can keep growing, while also not getting them too fat though. You
That
don't want
makes
to leave
problems
your
too.
Yeah, you don't want to leave your replacement ewe lambs in your feedlot on your fat lamb ration and just put fat on them. That's a whole topic in of itself, but you can get ewe lambs too fat where if you get ewe lambs too fat, you ruin their whole lifespan. If they put fat deposits in their udder, which they can do, those things are ruined for life.
It'll
So
affect their milk production
we
permanently.
sometime we need to do a whole podcast on ewe lambs because that is a very important piece of the puzzle. But anyway,
It is. Yeah.
one other thing we haven't talked about at all is teaser rams. Are you using teaser rams, Leon?
Not currently. The subject of using teaser rams, that would be a great episode in and of itself. If you're a listener out there and you're using a teaser ram or a teaser billy, it'd be interesting to hear from you. We enjoy hearing the pros and cons, how you think it works for your flock. If you could just give us a call at 717-310-3641 and select the option for the Sheep and Goat podcast and just leave us a voicemail, or you can shoot me an email at leon@lostcreekwholesale.net. We'd be glad to hear from you. Hey, I wish you all folks good luck with your upcoming breeding season. What breeding now means lambs into January. So
Yep.
it's about time to have some more lambs on the ground. I guess we'll have some fall lambs coming here pretty soon, but
we ultrasounded all ours, and I think we have a little over 100 ewes bred for fall lambs here, and they should start in about 3 or 4 weeks here. So I'm
Very good.
excited to get some fresh lambs on the ground again.
Yeah, we won't see any till October probably. We bred a little
Okay.
later. So, all right, folks, that's it for today. Thanks again for listening. And once again, if you have any suggestions for topics you'd like to hear discussed, or if you have somebody you think we should get on the call to discuss a topic they might be a pro at, give us a call, let us know, shoot us an email. Thanks again. We'll catch up with you next time.